Jesus the Pharisee by Hyam Maccoby. Chapter 1. Who were the Pharisees? The incident of Gamaliel. Who were the Pharisees? This might seem as an easy question to answer. According to Josephus, the New Testament and the rabbinical writings, the Pharisees were the dominant religious grouping of the 1st century CE, at the time when the Jerusalem temple was still standing. In the Gospels, the Pharisees are treated from a hostile standpoint, but their dominance and authority among the majority of the Jewish people is not questioned. It is the New Testament that says that the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. According to Josephus, the Pharisees had the allegiance of the people, who followed their religious rulings and regarded them with the highest reverence. According to the Pharisees were the movement from which the rabbinic movement itself derived. The leading Pharisee teachers, Hillel and Shammai, are called the fathers of the world, by which no doubt the rabbinic world is meant, since the rabbis certainly did not intend to raise the authority of Hillel and Shammai above that of canonical figures such as Moses, the prophets, and Ezra. In recent years, however, this picture has changed in the eyes of many scholars, especially under the influence of Jacob Neusner. The Pharisees have dwindled into a small sect comprising only one of the many Judaisms of the 1st century. The rabbinic claim to continuity with the Pharisees has become suspect. Instead, the theory has gained ground that this claim was an unhistorical attempt by rabbis to acquire traditional authority for their own assertion of dominance and for their own enactments. It has been stressed that the rabbinic writings are late. The earliest of them, the Mishnah, was composed at about 200 CE. Various doubts have been thrown on the accounts found in Josephus and the New Testament, each being alleged to have motivations for exaggerating the influence of the Pharisees. Moreover, doubt has been cast on the assumption that Pharisees and scribes in the New Testament are to be regarded as alternative and equivalent terms. Sometimes Jesus is questioned or attacked by Pharisees, sometimes by scribes, and sometimes by scribes and Pharisees. Who, then, were the scribes? Perhaps it has been argued they were a separate group altogether from the Pharisees. Even more puzzling, then, is the expression that sometimes occurs. For example, Mark 2:16, my translation, the scribes of the Pharisees. Perhaps this means that other groups, the Sadducees for example, also had scribes. The view upheld here is that the scribes and the Pharisees mentioned in the New Testament are members of the same movement. They are mentioned together so frequently that the authors of the Gospels must have thought of them as very closely identified. Sometimes a story told in one Gospel about Pharisees becomes a story about scribes in another. The evidence of the rabbinic writings is important here. They sometimes are the word scribes as equivalent to rabbis, as an expression the words of the scribes, divrei sofrim, which it is desired to distinguish rabbinic from Toranic ordinances. Compelling also is the evidence of the New Testament, Josephus and the rabbinic writings, that the Pharisee scribes were the dominant religious party in Jesus' day, and that there was strong continuity between them and the rabbinic movement. If they were not prominent and authoritative in their day, it is hard to see why the rabbis should think it is worthwhile to manufacture a continuity with them. Moreover, the argument particularly put forward by Jacob Neusner that Pharisee-Sadducee controversies mentioned in the Mishnah are 2nd century rabbinic concoctions has been much weakened by the publication of the MMT document of the Dead Sea Scrolls. See chapter 11, note 1 on page 210, which shows that these same controversies were actively pursued in the 1st century. The gap in time between the Mishnah and the 1st century is to some extent an illusion. The Mishnah was indeed written down as late as 200 CE, but it is not a composition of that date, but a compilation of materials, many of which clearly existed in an early period. This is even evidence that the Mishnah itself is only the latest of a series of compilations constructed on a similar plan, the earliest of which dates to about 100 CE. One rabbinic work, Megillat Ta'anit, actually dates by a common scholarly consent from the 1st century itself. Moreover, the Targumim, translations of the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic, though edited in the 2nd century, were partly composed in the 1st century and contain some interesting pre-Tanatic halachic interpretations that escaped the process of revision, throwing light on the continuous process of development of halakha from the 1st to the 2nd century. Many of the rabbinic leaders mentioned and quoted in the Mishnah were born and spent their youth in the 1st century. This applies not just to Hillel and Shammai and their immediate followers, whose activity was entirely in the 1st century, but even to the prominent figures whose main work was in the 2nd century, such as Joshua ben Hananiah and Rabbi Eliezer. See page 116. So the gap is by no means as enormous as it is often represented to be. The testimony of Josephus that the Pharisees were revered by the vast majority of the people seems plain enough, yet some modern scholars have felt impelled to suspect Josephus's motives in saying this. Nussner's theory was that Josephus shows a change of attitude from his earlier work, which was much less favorable to the Pharisees, and this change had a political motivation. The rabbis of Josephus's latter days were consolidated the authority granted to them by the Romans by claiming continuity with the Pharisees, and Josephus decided to bolster this claim by propaganda, aggrandizing the status of the Pharisees. This speculation has been abandoned by one of Nussner's closest disciples, Anthony Saldarini, who has pointed out that every stage of the reasoning exhibits flaws. Josephus did not change his attitude to the Pharisees in his latter work. His alleged political association with the Pharisees of his day has no historical basis, and the alleged alignment of the rabbis with Roman power had not yet taken place in Josephus' lifetime. We may thus attach great importance and credence to Josephus' statement about the Pharisees, especially as it is the testimony of someone who, on the whole, had a negative attitude towards them. They are able greatly to persuade the body of a people, and whatever they, the people, do not do about divine worship, prayers, and sacrifices, they perform them according to the Pharisees' direction, insomuch that the cities give great attestations to them on account of their entire virtuous conduct, both in the actions of their lives and in their discourses too. Further, Josephus says about the Sadducees, they are able to do almost nothing of themselves, for when they become magistrates, unwillingly and by force sometimes they addict themselves to the notions of the Pharisees, because the multitude would not otherwise bear them. Antiquities, chapter 18, 3-4. Book 18, 3-4. Josephus is here asserting that the Pharisees' influence extended to the rites of the temple, since he stresses that the sacrifices were offered in accordance with Pharisee principles. Yet Saldarini dismisses as unhistorical the very same statement when made in the rabbinic literature. He also dismisses rabbinic claims that the Pharisees created the liturgy. Yet Josephus makes the same assertion Saldarini, while combating the theory of Josephus's propaganda aimed in relation to the Pharisees, fails to follow through this insight when he disregards the consonance between Josephus and the rabbinic writings. In particular, he rejects or at least doubts the rabbinic claim that the Sadducees in practice bowed to Pharisee rulings because of the pressure of popular opinion. Though Josephus makes a point of this in general, Saldorini adopts a skeptical approach towards rabbinic assertions about the Pharisees, but fails to appreciate the significance of the agreement of rabbinic statements with those of Josephus, whom he admits to have been free of rabbinic influence. The rabbinic agreement with Josephus casts an entirely new light on the question of rabbinic historical links with the Pharisee movement. Instead of interpreting the rabbinic statements as mythical, we must acknowledge that the rabbinic literature shows accurate knowledge of the religious situation of the first century and must be taken seriously. Saldarini, while freeing himself in some respects from the scenarios of Nosna, still cannot accept the well-attested fact that the Pharisees were not just one sect among many, but represented the views of a vast majority of the Jewish people. Yet Saldarini at least accepts that the Pharisees did not regard themselves as a sect like the Dead Sea Scrolls sect, cutting themselves off from the people as a whole, but on the contrary made every effort to mix with the people and appeal to them by what Josephus calls their discourses, a term which, as we shall see, page 92 to 99, links the Pharisees to Jesus and his parables and sermons. One of the sayings attributed to Hillel, the greatest Pharisee leader, is, "Do not separate from the community." How this saying can be reconciled with a commonly alleged meaning of the word Pharisee is discussed below, pages 78 to 81. Josephus is also at pains to stress the Pharisees' high reputation for entire virtuous conduct among the people. Here Josephus' change of vocabulary from people to cities cannot be given the sociological significance which some scholars have given. This description is very much at odds with the diatribes against the Pharisees in the New Testament as oppressors and hypocrites who were actually hated by the people. Yet the odd fact is that certain passages in the New Testament itself contradict this hostile picture. Prominent among these dissident pages is the account given in Acts 5 of the role of Gamaliel in saving Peter and his associates from the condemnation desired by the high priest, who was described as a Sadducee. Here is the description of Gamaliel given in this passage. A member of the council rose to his feet, a Pharisee called Gamaliel, a teacher of the law held in high regard by all the people. Acts 5:34. Then follows Gamaliel's speech in which he pleads for mercy for Peter and his associates. For if this idea of theirs or its execution is of human origin, it will collapse, but if it is from God, you will never be able to put them down, and you risk finding yourselves at war with God. Acts 5:38 to 39. The full significance of this passage is obscured by the fact that Gamaliel is described as merely a member of the council and as a Pharisee. It is not revealed by the author of Acts, probably Luke, that Gamaliel was not just an individual Pharisee, but the leader of a whole Pharisee movement. We learn this information from the rabbinic literature in which Gamaliel figures prominently, and there is no reason to doubt this evidence. As the leader of the Pharisees, Gamaliel naturally carried all the other Pharisee members of the council or Sanhedrin with him when the matter came to a vote, and Peter was duly rescued from death. Yet the impression left by the text is that Gamaliel was a lone individual who by some miraculous means persuaded the other Pharisees to acquit Peter, which otherwise they would not have been inclined to do. Peter, which otherwise they would not have been inclined to do. Apologies. This is certainly the interpretation that was accepted by Christian exegetes, who even invented the legend that Gamaliel was a secret convert to Christianity. He is located together with other individual Pharisees such as Nicodemus, John 3:1, and probably Joseph of Arimathea, a secret disciple for the fear of the Jews, John 19:38, who felt sympathy for Jesus despite the general Pharisee hostility to him. Yet the author of Acts must have known that Gamaliel was not just an ordinary Pharisee, but the leader and chief representative of the Pharisees, the immediate successor of the great Hillel, and he must have realized that many of the readers of Acts would also know this. It is therefore a problem that this episode was included, even though it throws the greatest doubt on the whole gospel picture of Pharisee hostility to Jesus and his movement. Peter was brought before the Sanhedrin at the instigation of the high priest on a charge of spreading the message of Jesus. If Jesus had indeed been the person depicted in the Gospels as a blasphemer and Sabbath breaker, who so aroused the hatred and anger of the Pharisees that they constantly sought his death, why did the leader of the Pharisees defend Jesus' chief disciple and even state that Peter's advocacy might be from God? Modern scholars, while rejecting traditional Christian explications, have generally underrated the significance of this problematic passage and tried in various ways to explain it away, or perhaps they have understood its significance only too well. The historicity of the episode has been doubted, especially on the ground that Gamaliel, in his speech, mentions Theudas as a figure similar to Jesus, though we know from Josephus that Theudas belonged to a latter date. This is hardly a reason to doubt the historicity of the reported stance of Gamaliel, since Luke may very well have got a detail wrong in his attempt to reconstruct Gamaliel's words, while correctly reporting Gamaliel's overall attitude. But in any case, the problem remains, why did the author of Acts go out of his way to attribute support for Peter to a prominent Pharisee, and indeed credit the council representatives of the Pharisee movement as a whole with the rescue of Jesus' chief disciple? The problem is not so acute in the latter rescue of Paul from the high priest by the council Pharisees, though this episode too is instructive in showing the gap between Pharisees and the high priest, a gap much obscured in the Gospels. Since here, Paul misleadingly identified himself as a Pharisee, not as a Christian. But here in Acts 5, there can be no doubt that the account represents the Pharisees as siding with someone who declared himself unequivocally a follower of Jesus. A recent explanation is that of Saldarini. His view is that the author of Acts includes a number of remarks favorable to the Pharisees because one of its aims is to assert continuity between the early Christian church and Judaism. The Gamaliel episode is thus understandable in the context of this aim. Here Saldarini is following this line taken by Jack T. Sanders, whose mere detailed formulation will be considered below. It can be seen at once, however, that when we compare the other favorable remarks with the Gamaliel episode, we see a world of difference. They all concern the tendency of individual Pharisees to join the Jesus movement or to show sympathy for it as individuals. None of them suggests a tolerance of the Jesus movement as a whole by the Pharisee movement as a whole. On the contrary, Acts strongly reinforces the picture of the Gospels of the Pharisees as implacable enemies of the Jesus movement. Moreover, one particular aspect of Acts that drives home an anti-Pharisee message the story of a persecution by Saul, later Paul, of a Jerusalem church. This is imputed to Saul's Pharisaic zeal. It is true that this intolerance conflicts puzzlingly with the attitude of Saul's alleged teacher, Gamaliel, but this only reinforces the uniqueness of the Gamaliel episode, that the author of Acts records both Saul's intolerance and Gamaliel's tolerance is one of the most remarkable puzzles of the New Testament studies. The only feeble attempt in Acts to minimize this revealing incident was to suppress the actual position of Gamaliel among the Pharisees as their teacher and chief representative. The survival of this incident in the narrative goes far beyond Saldarini's concept of a desire on Luke's part to present a picture of continuity between the Jerusalem church and Judaism. The incident portrays instead an actual solidarity. Gamaliel was asserting his approval of the Jesus movement as showing no trace of heresy, and therefore as sharing the main tenets of the Pharisaic movement itself. He compares it with other movements which attempted a messianic coup without promulgating any doctrines but conflicting with Pharisee ideas. These messianic movements actually arose out of Pharisaism. In the case of Judas of Galilee, whom Gamaliel mentions, the testimony of Josephus is that the movement of zealots which he founded agree in all other things with the Pharisaic notions, but they have an inviolable attachment to liberty. Antiquities 18:23. The only difference between such messianic movements and the Pharisees as a whole was that most Pharisees adopted a cautious, wait-and-see attitude towards messianic claims and preferred, like Gamaliel himself, to await the outcome while contemplating the daring aims of the messianic movements arising from their inviolable attachment to liberty, with sympathy and hope. Gamaliel's defense of Peter is very far-reaching in its implications. It means that Peter was not advocating Jesus as a divine Messiah, but merely as a human Messiah, whose aim was to liberate the Jews from the Roman yoke. Otherwise, Gamaliel would certainly not have supported Peter and the Jesus movement. The attitude of Jesus' disciples is actually portrayed by Luke Acts itself, when it represents Jesus' immediate followers as saying, "We had been hoping that he would be the man to liberate Israel," Luke 24:21, and even requesting the resurrected Jesus if he would now restore the kingdom, Acts 1:6. Jesus' movement was patriotic and insurrectionist. It aimed at liberation from the Roman occupation. It had no notion of elevating Jesus to divine status. It also had no aim of abolishing the Jewish religion. The Jerusalem church shows no sign of doing this, but is portrayed in Acts as very observant of the Jewish laws. As E.P. Sanders pointed out, if Jesus taught that the Torah was at an end, his disciples show no sign of having learned this from him. Sanders concluded that Jesus did not actually teach the supersession of the Torah. The book of Acts portrays Peter as a very observant Jew who had never tasted any food forbidden by Jewish law. Of course, one of the main themes of Acts is the gradual education of Peter into an anti-Torah attitude, but this implies that he did not learn this from Jesus himself. The adherence of Peter and the other disciples to Judaism is explained in the Gospels by the concept of the stupidity of the disciples who never understood what Jesus was really teaching. But this concept is very questionable and is best explained as an ex post facto attempt by the latter Pauline Church to reconcile the Torah observance of a Jerusalem church with the alleged anti-Torah teaching of Jesus. The point that is relevant to the present discussion, however, is that if Peter and his associates were preaching the supersession of the Torah, they would never have attracted the support of Gamaliel. Another implication of the Gamaliel incident is that the trial and condemnation of Jesus himself never happened. This conclusion has been reached by many scholars for other reasons, chiefly the inherent contradictions of the accounts given in the synoptic gospels and the lack of knowledge they show of the procedure of the Sanhedrin. Also, a very weighty consideration is that the fourth gospel does not mention any Sanhedrin trial of Jesus at all, but instead describes an interrogation of Jesus carried out by Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest, and by Caiaphas himself, without any judicial procedure. John 18. Here the fourth gospel, though in many respects the least historically reliable of the four gospels, being replete with Christology of a late character, shows that it has access to sources other than those used by the synoptic gospels, of which it is independent. Another important example of this is the fourth gospel's omission of all reference to the institution of the Eucharist in its account of the Last Supper. While fully aware of the unhistoricity of a trial described in the synoptic gospels, scholars have not appreciated the importance in this connection of the Gamaliel incident in Acts 5. If Peter, Jesus' chief disciple, was defended by the Pharisees, Gamaliel at the meeting of the Sanhedrin Gamaliel at the meeting of the Sanhedrin on a charge of being a follower of Jesus, where 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 were the Pharisees, and particularly Gamaliel, at the trial of Jesus himself? If Gamaliel saw no harm in Jesus' movement, how could he have seen any harm in the founder of the movement, Jesus? If such a trial had taken place, would he not have given the same reasons for quitting Jesus and declared that his messianic claim should be judged by its results, and that it might turn out to be from God, and that its opponents might in the event be shown to be enemies of God? Note that Gamaliel appears in the trial of Peter to be completely unaware of any charge of blasphemy against Jesus, that is, that he had claimed divine status. Does not this show that no such charge was ever made against Jesus? This is further proof that the earliest followers of Jesus, known as Nazarenes and later Ebionites, did not regard Jesus as a divine personage, but as a claim to the title of Messiah, which in Jewish parlance of the time carried no connotation of deity, but meant merely King of the Jews, its literal meaning being the Anointed One, since every Davidic king was anointed with a special mixture of oils at his coronation ceremony. So that every Davidic king, even those who did evil in the sight of the Lord, have a title of Messiah. This did not apply to non-Davidic kings, such as the Hasmoneans, who were not called Messiah. The only way, then, that Jesus could have been condemned at the Sanhedrin trial is if there were no Pharisees present at it, and especially if Gamaliel was not present at it. Yet Gamaliel was definitely the leader of the Pharisees at the time of Jesus' trial, which took place only a short time before Jesus' trial. But can we conceive a meeting of the Sanhedrin without the presence of Pharisees, who, as the trials of both Peter and Paul show, actually constituted the majority of the members of the council? This would be like a meeting in the British House of Commons, in which some important decision was passed without the presence of a majority party. Such a meeting could hardly be regarded as a valid parliamentary session, and the report that such a meeting occurred would simply not be believed. It is actually a remarkable fact that Pharisees make hardly any appearance in the Gospel accounts of the trial of Jesus. The Gospel of Luke omits all mention of them, and the other Gospels make only obscure hints at their presence. This is very surprising. This is very surprising view of the prominence given earlier to accounts of conflict between the Pharisees and Jesus. If the Pharisees had indeed sought Jesus' death on many occasions because of his Sabbath healing, why did they not seize the opportunity to come forward as his trial with this very accusation, which the Gospels assert so strongly to be a capital charge in Pharisee law? In the event, the Gospel accounts of Jesus' trial do not even mention this allegedly serious charge as a reason for condemning Jesus. So the absence of the Pharisees is one more piece of evidence that the alleged conflicts between the Pharisees and Jesus on the question of Sabbath healing also never took place, a conclusion that is confirmed by the copious evidence from rabbinic sources that the Pharisees did not forbid Sabbath healing, but actually encouraged it. Using arguments identical with those attributed to Jesus in the Gospels, for example, Jesus' dictum, the Sabbath was raised from man, not man for the Sabbath, is found in the Talmud precisely in the context of justifying Sabbath healing. See page 124. Thus, the implications of the Gamaliel incident are indeed multiple and far-reaching. This incident alone, if taken seriously, is sufficient to invalidate the majority of the gospel story. The alleged conflict between Jesus and the chief Jewish religious authorities, that is, the Pharisees, the alleged trial of Jesus as a blasphemer, the concept of Jesus' mission as a divine visitant intent on suffering crucifixion in order to bring salvation, and the alleged responsibility of the Jews, rather than the Romans, as the betrayers and killers of Jesus, a charge that gave rise to the demonization of the Jews. We must look further, however, at the attempts that have been made to minimize the importance of the Gamaliel incident. Attempts that arise in some cases, it may be plausibly supposed, from awareness, conscious or unconscious, of its destructive implications for the whole Christian anti-Jewish and pro-Roman myth. On the whole, the chief strategy has been simply to ignore the incident altogether. W. G. Kummel's celebrated introduction to the New Testament contains no discussion of the Gamaliel incident, and does not even include the name Gamaliel in the index. It is hard to believe that this acute scholar saw no special difficulties in the incident worthy of discussion. The same authors the New Testament, the history of the investigation of its problems, shows the same total lack of interest in this subject. Even the comprehensive dictionary of biblical interpretation edited by R. L. Coggins and J. L. Holden contains no article about Gamaliel, no mention of him in the index, and no mention of him even in the article about the Pharisees. Consultation of some school textbooks shows a preference for the view that Gamaliel was simply shown a practical, common sense approach in advocating a wait and see policy towards the early Christians. No appreciation is shown for the difficulty that Peter was preaching a doctrine that, according to the previous narrative, had been recently condemned as so blasphemous and destructive of Judaism that its originator had been hounded to death. It is as if Pope Innocent III, the 12th century, were to advocate a wait-and-see policy towards the Albigensians instead of launching a crusade against them as dangerous heretics. The very fact that Gamaliel advocated a wait-and-see policy shows that he saw nothing heretical or blasphemous in Peter's preaching, but only an announcement of historical or eschatological developments that might or might not occur, and in any case could occasion only hope or disappointment, not condemnation. The only extended discussion of the topic that I have been able to find is that Jack T. Sanders, in his valuable book The Jews in Luke and Acts, it cannot be said, however, that even Sanders appreciates fully the problematic nature of the Gamaliel incident and its implications. Sanders is struck by the number of instances in Luke and Acts where the Pharisees are treated in a friendly manner. On the other hand, he acknowledges that Luke Acts also contains some very unfriendly episodes concerning Pharisees. including even some conflict stories between Jesus and the Pharisees, not contained in the other Gospels, the attitude of which is much more uniformly anti-Pharisee. Sanders sees here a problem that requires resolution. Why this mixture of friendliness and unfriendliness works friendliness towards the Pharisees in Luke and Acts? His solution, rather like that of Saldarini discussed earlier, though Saldarini is more concerned with a question of continuity, lies in Luke's attitude to the Jewish Christians. Luke is aware that the Jewish Christians who comprised Jesus' earliest followers and who constituted the Jerusalem church had an attitude towards religious practice and belief that was indistinguishable from that of the Pharisees. Luke's friendly allusions to Pharisees then are all gestures towards rapprochement with Jewish Christians and do not preclude a most unfriendly attitude towards the Pharisees themselves as prosecutors of Jesus and Christianity. This explanation can hardly be regarded as satisfactory, especially in relation to the Gamaliel incident, which Sanders treats as just one more instance of pro-Pharisee sentiment in Luke Acts, not different in kind from the other most striking incidents. The warning recorded by no other gospel, given by the Pharisees to Jesus that saved his life from Herod Antipas, Luke 13:31. The latter incident is certainly striking, yet it does not involve the entire Pharisee movement and can be read as a friendly act performed by a group of Pharisees having much in common with the Jerusalem church commentators, beginning with Loisi, even read the incident as a pretension, which clearly arises from reluctance to see any good in the rest of the narrative, good in any Pharisees in view of the dastardly behavior attributed to them in the rest of the narrative. What distinguishes the Gamaliel incident is its representative character. Saunders' explanation of the friendly Pharisees also in Luke acts existing alongside a plentiful supply of unfriendly Pharisees as symbolic representatives of the Jerusalem church has merit, but this does not begin to explain the Gamaliel incident. My own view is that Luke simply overreached himself. He did, as Saunders explained, want to present a composite picture of good Pharisees, bad Pharisees. The good Pharisees were those who were sympathetic to the Jesus movement and even comprised a large proportion of the Jerusalem church, thus providing the continuity that Jews primarily sought. The bad Pharisees were those who were totally opposed to Jesus and his followers. To betray his good Pharisees, Luke used sources which the other gospel writers suppressed, and these sources provided some of the most authentic materials to be found in the gospels on the principle of tendence criticism. See chapter 12, page 157, for fuller explanation of this term. That what goes against the tendence is liable to be trustworthy. Luke went some way towards giving the game away when he included the incident of a Pharisee saving Jesus' life. This incident is at the very least surprising in view of the general gospel picture of the Pharisees as hostile to Jesus. But Luke, going beyond his intentions, gave the game away entirely when he included from his authentic sources the Gamaliel incident, which threw brilliant light on the true historical relationship between the Pharisees and Jesus. Here Luke relied on the obfuscation by which he portrayed Gamaliel as just one Pharisee among many, and therefore as just another Nicodemus. He did not fear a reaction inappropriate to his purpose because he was writing for Gentile readers to whom the name Gamaliel meant nothing. He did not know that a voluminous Jewish literature would later rise embodying traditions in which this same Gamaliel features as one of the fathers of rabbinic Judaism and as the leader of the whole Pharisee movement. Luke's incautious use of his sources, in contrast with the policy of suppression of the other gospel writers, resulted in the preservation of precious documentary evidence of the history of the early church and its relationship to Pharisaic Judaism. End of chapter.